Welcome, welcome. This is Plato's Pod, Dialogues on the Works of Plato. Today is April 11, 2021. This podcast is audio recording of a live meetup group. We meet through Toronto Philosophy Meetup, Calgary Philosophy Meetup, Online Rebels Meetup. I am Eva Ellis. I will be coordinating this episode, and I would like to now pass the screen or the microphone to James Myers for today's discussion. Hi, James.
Good morning, Eva, from this rainy spring morning in Toronto. So how are you?
I'm good, thank you, and I'm excited. I would like to ask, what are we discussing about today?
Well, thank you. And so we were discussing, or continuing our discussion of Plato's Phaedrus, which we started 2 weeks ago when we looked at the first part that went to 257b. And so today we'll be picking up the remainder of the Phaedrus. You know, we had such a great discussion last time. It was actually some of the most thoughtful, insightful ideas came forward in the discussion in our last episode, things that I really hadn't thought of before. And I think it really helped to illustrate the power of dialogue and the power of speech, because, really fundamentally, this dialogue of Plato's Phaedrus is really fundamentally about speech and what speech does. And I think, we'll start off today's discussion maybe by looking at the purpose of speech, which is in one of the readings that is posted on the shared drive. Very happy to, have reviewed the recording of the last episode, because some of these ideas are pretty amazing. One of the points made was that the meaning is derived from the use that we make of speech. And so the particular applications that we're talking about, and one of the participants made the comment that meaning is derived in use. And I think that was a very powerful point. Another participant, I think it might have been JK, who's here with us today as well, made the point that the soul is maybe like a public entity. Public is in kind of a shared presence, so what your soul does affects my soul, what my soul does affects your soul. And it's kind of this kind of public presence of the soul, one soul affecting the other. And that kind of analogy to the soul being a public entity, I thought was a pretty powerful analogy to understand, I think, what Plato's trying to talk about when he talks about the soul. The other comment that I thought was really interesting was the idea of a soul as a multifaceted entity. So it has different facets or faces. And, the diagram that I have on my screen background here is a tetrahedron, actually, which is one of the 5 so-called Platonic solids that Plato brought to us in his dialogue, the Timaeus, which we, looked at in past number of episodes. And you can see in this is actually this screen image that I have behind me is actually a tetrahedron in a sphere. And we can see the different facets in a tetrahedron. There's 4 different faces. And this idea that one of the participants brought in the last episode of the soul being a multifaceted entity, I thought was really interesting. And you have to kind of touch the different facets of the soul, because that's one of the things that Plato wrote about in the first part of the Phaedrus, that the soul has these different gradients or different levels of understanding. And that's something that we can certainly pick up on in today's episode. So definitely it was a great discussion last time. We also touched on the idea of general forms of understanding, and that got us into kind of thinking about the difference between a general form and a particular form. And then that led us into thinking about Plato's theory of forms, which I think starts to come through. The more I read this dialogue, the more I see these connections. And certainly, Plato's theory of forms does come through very strongly, I think, especially with this idea of the general forms that we started talking about last time, this general form of understanding. And I think we, part of our discussion last time focused on maybe the general forms being categories of understanding. And then from those categories, we come into specific areas of understanding and deriving meaning. And we had that fascinating discussion last time, too, about translation of languages and translating according to meaning, which was something I learned actually from our discussion. I hadn't realized that translation is made according to meaning. And so, again, demonstrating the power of dialogue and discussion is that, we go into these things not knowing where we're going to come out. And I didn't know that I was going to learn all of those things. And now I've learned them. So very, very pleased and excited to think about today's discussion and the things that we'll learn. So as I said, every time I read Phaedrus, and in fact, every time I read a lot of Plato's dialogues, I get these new areas of meaning and logical connections. And so I've sort of designed, and we can take the discussion wherever we want today. There's no really set agenda, but I've sort of designed, maybe 3 different areas that we could look at, and those are in the readings that are posted on the shared drive for those who access the meetup notice. And so we can look at those specific readings, or we can go wherever people like in our own dialogue today. So that's, I think, the benefit of Plato, is that there's no set agenda, there's no set way or order of doing things. It's really, I think, what we find in our own logical process. So again, welcome to everybody. Welcome especially to our new participants. It's always great to see new people joining us, and whether you're experienced with Plato, or whether this is the first exposure you've had to Plato, I think hopefully there's something here for everybody. And so very excited to have new participants especially joining us today, which is great to see. So again, the podcast is being recorded in voice only today. We'll use the first name as it appears in your screen profile. If you want to change your screen profile just to show one name only, that's fine. We'll use the raise hands feature on Zoom if you'd like to speak, and I'll take, as I have before, kind of speakers in order that the hands are raised. But I'll give preference, if somebody's spoken multiple times, I'll give preference to somebody who hasn't spoken before, which I think is fair. And I think we'll start there. I just wanted to go back to this idea of general forms that I just spoke about, and that we focused on in the first episode on the Phaedrus 2 weeks ago. And Eva, maybe if you could bring up that first image, and this is on the cover page of the reading notes that are posted on the shared drive, and it relates to this image of the tetrahedron that I have on my screen here. So the image of the tetrahedron that I have on my screen background, the tetrahedron is a 3-dimensional object, and it's one of the objects that I mentioned that Plato brought to us in his dialogue, the Timaeus. So in the Timaeus, Plato set out the only 5 regular solids in the universe, one of them being the tetrahedron, which is the 3-dimensional object I have on the screen behind me. It's got 4 triangular faces, and each face is a equilateral triangle, which means that at each corner it has 60-degree angles. And so if you could just bring that triangle image on the screen up a little bit, Eva, this is just so we can see. Yeah, that's great. So this image on this that Eva has on the screen, which is on the first page of the notes, is a 2-dimensional tetrahedron. So this is what's called a net of a tetrahedron. So it's as if you took the tetrahedron that's on the screen behind me in 3 dimensions, and you kind of folded it down into 2 dimensions. This is what you would get, the net of a tetrahedron. So what we're seeing here for our listeners on the screen is a 2-dimensional object. It's an equilateral triangle, and it contains 4 different equilateral triangles. And there's 3 different colors inside. And so I just thought it would illustrate the point maybe that we were talking about last time about this idea of general forms, and maybe just ask these 3 questions that I put underneath this triangle that's on the screen, this 2-dimensional triangle. And the 3 questions are: what number of thing or things are in this image? Second question: what number of thing or things in general form are there in this image? And then the third question is: what number of thing or things in particular form are there in this image? And I just thought I would use this maybe to illustrate maybe one way we can think about Plato's idea of general forms. And so I just wondered if I just thought I would put the question out there. Would anybody like to answer any of these 3 questions? What number of thing or things are in this image? And then do you see a difference between general form and particular forms in this image? Joe.
James, I'm just going to address the very first question, what number of things are in this image? And I'm not going to answer it, but I'm going to ask a question about it. I'm sorry if it sounds like an ignorant question, but in Plato's time, were the concept of infinity already discussed?
That's a good question. I haven't. Well, I mean, I think Plato certainly refers. Maybe he doesn't use the word infinity, but certainly when I'm thinking of Timaeus 28a, which I talk about a lot. That just my favorite passage probably in all of Timaeus is 28a, where he talks about the distinction between that which always is and never becomes, and that which becomes or always becomes but never is. And so there's that distinction that he makes at Timaeus 28a. And I'm thinking just, Joe, in response to your question, maybe that idea of that which always is but never becomes is a way of referring to infinity or thinking about infinity. I just put it out there. I don't know. I'm not sure that he used the word infinite or infinity in the way that we like. Part of the problem is translation, right? I mean, when people translate from the ancient Greek into modern English, there's different ways to translate words. For example, another way of saying infinity might be without limit, right? And so it's a good question actually, because we talked about translation in our last episode, and if a word was used in ancient Greek, does it necessarily translate into the English word infinity? In fact, Joe, I think last time you raised the point about one of the words in one of the readings that we had last time. Here it is, actually. It was in 249c of Phaedrus, in which Plato said that, I'll just read it actually, because I think it's a good point today. But a soul that never saw the truth cannot take a human shape, since a human being must understand speech in terms of general forms, proceeding to bring many perceptions into a reasoned unity. And I think, Joe, last time you raised the question, when the translation says a reasoned unity, you asked the question, would it really be our reasoned unity? And so there's a lot in translation, I think. So I don't know, what do other people think about Joe's question and the idea about general and specific forms in this, Jean?
So during Plato's time, was the concept of infinity, this so-called discovered, this so-called known? I think it already is framing the question itself is framing something. It's not a completely open question. It's using language. It's itemizing the knowing as a certain thing that we publicly and consciously seemingly aware and define what it is. So I think it's kind of half and half, where it's possible that they may know in a certain way something, for example, subconsciously or unconsciously, but may not necessarily clarified between the members. So it feels like it is not discovered, but they may know in a different, more vague level. So so it's not a yes and no question.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Jean. And actually, I think you just touched on a theme that we talked about last time too, and I think will be more evident in today's discussion, and this idea of knowledge as remembering. And so I think maybe what you were just saying, Jean, is maybe they didn't use specifically infinity, but maybe they had some sort of internal memory of the idea of infinity, even if it wasn't explicit. If I'm just kind of maybe paraphrasing from what you said, but I think it's a very good point actually that brings us to this idea that knowledge is remembering, and we'll discuss that today in the second reading that I've got, this the legend of Thamus and Theuth, which I think is a really powerful little legend that Plato puts in the Phaedrus in this part that we'll discuss today. JK, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with you that their idea of infinity is implied in the whole concept of concepts of being and becoming, because what they mean is that that which always is another word for infinity. And also their geometry and mathematics must include numbers that go on for infinity, right? That there's no end to numbers one way, backwards, or positively, or negatively.
Mm-hmm.
So this image right here I think has to do with the whole idea of the one and the many. So if you're talking about one thing, there you could see this as a one single triangle with smaller triangles within. So it would be one image in that sense. But there are also we'd also have to talk about these other smaller triangles within that includes the many images. So that would, if you answer the question, the first question, you'd have to also go into answering the other two questions, right? Because in general, it's one image, but in particular, it's the many and the one and the one and the many.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you raised a few really interesting points there. I mean, first of all, you made the statement that numbers never end, which I think actually that's a powerful idea, that maybe we can explore here, because do we know of an end to number? And did the ancient Greeks know of an end to number? I mean, and maybe this is something that really disturbed them. People say that they were disturbed at the idea of irrational numbers or incommensurable numbers. And so maybe that's something that, where that idea that Jean maybe spoke of, that sense of infinity that's in there but couldn't be expressed. And then you see these incommensurable numbers that go on forever and ever and ever. And so you made the point that numbers never end, and I like that. And the one and the many was the other point that you made, and certainly that's one of the central theses of, or questions of Plato's Parmenides, which has been mentioned a few times in our discussions. Is there a distinction between one and many? And so in this image here on the screen, the two-dimensional net of a tetrahedron, as you said, JK, we've got one triangle that encompasses, the other four. We've got different colors, but each of the triangles is the same. So, we've got a mixture of the same and the different here, maybe. And the same and the different, again, one of the themes of the Timaeus, in that dialogue where Plato or the character Timaeus describes the construction of the universe, there was that idea of the same and the different and mixing them together. It's a hard mixture, that they make the point in Timaeus of mixing the same and the different. But maybe I'm wondering if we're seeing that in here, in this, two-dimensional rendering of a three-dimensional tetrahedron that's here on the screen. And so just wondering, again, is there kind of a logical progression in these questions? What number of thing or things are in this image? What number of thing or things in general form are there in this image? Like, could we say generally that there's triangle in this image generally? And then particularly or specifically, could we say that each of these separate triangles has different characteristics? And I think the point here is really, kind of the way we speak about things, maybe. And I think maybe that's what Plato might be trying to demonstrate with Phaedrus. I mean, it's a very powerful idea. How do we speak of things? And how do we get this idea, the general idea across? And then how does each of us form specific ideas? So it's a powerful image, I think, or a powerful idea, that we can go from general ideas to specific ideas, and each of us, call it our souls or our animating forces or whatever drives us, we can form this meaning. And so that's where I really wanted to maybe just leap off for today's discussion. Where do we start today's discussion? And so the purpose of this kind of little geometric exercise at the beginning was maybe just to remind us of that discussion that we had last time of the idea of general forms. So generally there's triangle, but specifically there's some differences. And then, as JK, you said, that gets us into the idea of maybe the many and the one. I just wanted to, maybe launch from here into the idea of the purpose of speech, which I think is maybe a good point that we could, have some more detailed discussion today. But I'll start with, the one point that Plato makes at a particular section by just introducing an idea that a quote that I heard the other day when I attended a Center for Humane Technology online presentation, and the speaker quoted a sentence from the Federalist Papers. This was actually from Federalist Paper number 55, written by either James Madison or Alexander Hamilton. They're not sure. But these were kind of the founding documents of U.S. democracy. And so, back in that time, writers, and certainly the founding fathers of the U.S. were well steeped in philosophy. And so there's actually some interesting philosophy expressed in this, but it actually relates very much to the purpose of speech, which I thought we could maybe start talking about specifically today. And the quote that I heard in this presentation the other day was from Federalist Paper number 55, and it goes, "In all very numerous assemblies, of whatever characters composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob." So this was either James Madison or Alexander Hamilton writing in the Federalist Papers. And so what they conveyed, and maybe they didn't fully appreciate the character, the truly rational character of Socrates, who would never perhaps be allow reason to be taken away from him. But what I think this little quote does is actually presents the real power of speech. And so I'm just wondering what people think about the power of speech, and in particular, the statement that that Socrates makes it's at 271d in Phaedrus. He says, "Since the nature of speech is in fact to direct the soul, whoever intends to be a rhetorician must know how many kinds of soul there are." And so maybe I just start the discussion by saying, is the nature of speech in fact to direct the soul, as Socrates is saying? And how is the soul directed if it's not by speech? Are there other ways in which the soul is directed? And maybe just draw from your own personal experience or experience that you observe. What do you think of this role of speech, the purpose of speech, and the power of speech? So just wondering if there's any thoughts on that. Can you think of anything other than speech that directs the soul? And is this idea of direction important? What do we do with this direction? Is there direction in physical objects, for example? And is the direction in physical objects different from the metaphysical soul kind of idea? JK, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, he's talking about speech, rhetoric as a form of rationality, right? And but realistically, there are things, powers in nature itself that could be, like you mentioned, passions and so forth. But those are natural forces, right? That we try to control. But in the end, I don't know who's gonna win out. or reason, or human reason, or nature's passions or forces that are maybe directing us and behind the scenes. But I think of course Plato's view is that for us he believes that reason, our soul, is or should or is or should be in the one in control, and for him the natural passions and so forth are illusions, and maybe they're the ones that those forces can be controlled or held back by reason. I don't know if that's that's still raised the question of whether who's more in control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, is the soul the driver? And that image that that Plato brought in the first part of the Phaedrus of the soul being like the charioteer, and the chariot's being pulled by two horses. One is good, one is bad, and the horses are at kind of cross purposes, and then the soul is stuck here in the middle trying to direct and bring everything into, and I'll just return to that quote that I mentioned a few minutes ago from 249C about this process of bringing everything into a reasoned unity. And maybe that's kind of this idea of the soul, is that unifying force that brings all of this outside information into a reasoned unity. And again, looking at this triangle image on the screen, is there a reasoned unity to this image, and does that reason then expand out into the three-dimensional tetrahedron that I have on my screen background? So good ideas. Yeah. Jane, what are your thoughts?
Or on speech, I was thinking about power of speech, but also at the same time fallibility of speech. So when I think of speech, I think it does have a dysfunction similar to something that in our psyche the reason has. So speech is a guiding light. I think reason is a guiding light. So earlier I also mentioned when it comes to knowledge, there is you introduced the word implicit knowledge versus explicit knowledge. So reason and speech, to me, it seems like it gives us this guiding light to explicit knowledge, which is, as a human being, it's a special gift from God, maybe, and special tool that we have as a human animal. But it's not just, so I can think of speech and reason as some kind of a thoughts in the space compared to, between dots, we as a human beings, we think of pattern. And so we cannot help but cross the dots, because just dots is meaningless. So we, I think, in a way, automatically just cross dots. And then that's how we build our world view. And we do that with emotion, guide of emotion. So there is a guide of speech and reason, but also there is the other force that is like a two chariots, so to speak. There is a guide of passion and pathos and stuff like that, which we can see and we can point and we can name those reason and dots. But the problem with the passion and the in-betweens is that we just cannot point at it. We can cross it, we can somehow see it with maybe closed eyes, so to speak, but we cannot really communicate it in a clear linguistic way. So those two forces also, always kind of dance together in a way that some people sometimes fight with what exists versus what does not exist, because we cannot see that means it does not exist. So I think both has this guiding power toward us. And that's where this one and the many, and also the unity versus diversity. And art is also, it's all about unity, but we have to have a diversity to be able to recognize the unity, and also individual versus collective. Individual came out of collective, but still we are living as a one person. My name is Jean, your name is James, those parts. But without collective, there's no part. So all these two forces always interact with each other. They both have a guiding power in a different flavor.
I really like, Jean, the way you use the that phrase, reason is a guiding light and a special tool. That really resonates in me, and I think that's a lot of what Plato and other philosophers are trying to say. Is it's a really and so the way that you put it, I think, is very powerful. And this idea that passion is not controllable, I think you mentioned reason is connecting the dots, whereas there are no such connections available with the passions. And I think that's maybe what the writers of the Federalist paper were trying to say, is that passion gets out of control. When you put a bunch of people together and people start speaking, we forget and we let passion reign supreme when it shouldn't, and we forget our capacity of reason sometimes. So thank you. You really gave us a lot to think about in what you just said, Jean. Greg, I know you were trying to raise your hand. I don't know if the raise hands feature is working yet or not for you, but if you'd like to speak, Greg, jump in.
Okay. I was wondering, I'll try to find out the hand raising thing, but yeah. Anyway, for the moment, I found this particular time I don't have. But anyway, if I will jump in, I will jump in. Thank you for the offering.
Yeah. Okay, and then I just I noticed that it's hard for me to follow actually the chat screen as I'm moderating the discussion, but I noticed that James had a point that he posted in the chat screen about dreams maybe guiding the soul, and so maybe we can talk about that in terms of, and maybe other examples of things that may guide the soul as well. I have Reggie with a hand up. Reggie?
Yes, hi. Yeah, a very interesting discussion. I was thinking that the logos, the word of God, and if you're divine, I think we're all part of the soul, part of the universe, part of God, and everything. The word is just a vibration, from my understanding, and passion is a vibration. And as long as these vibrations are in harmony with nature, and that harmony doesn't harm anyone, it doesn't, it seems like a lot of people use that passion and they think they're above God, above nature, and they seem to do destruction and a lot of disharmony. So my concept is, again, to try to live within nature in that harmonious state, to not to hurt animals, not to hurt trees, or I guess it's more of a Buddhist thing, you know what I mean, to do no harm. So there's a deeper understanding of this, and it's a philosophy of blissfulness, I guess. Because when you think this way, you can give a lot more, use your passion for constructive things, not to hurt one another. So just thoughts that came in my mind. Thank you.
And they're great thoughts, and thank you, Reggie, for joining us. Welcome. I mean, wow, that vibrations in harmony. I love that. It's and I was just looking, actually, as you said that there is actually a point in the Phaedrus dialogue in the second part of the reading that we're doing today that actually talks about harmony. I'll put my finger on it and come back to it, because you raised a really important point there, that this idea of harmony and harmonizing things, and maybe that kind of relates a little bit to what Jean just said in terms of connecting the points, right? Like you need to connect, if you're connecting points using some sort of reason, connecting them into a reasoned unity, then reason seems to demand some sort of harmony, maybe. And then that gets us back to the question that we started with: what directs us in this process of reasoning? What directs the soul? So, the idea of speech directing the soul, the idea that James mentioned in the chat about maybe dreams directing the soul. Is there a difference between dreams and speech? What are dreams based on? Are dreams based on speech? Lots of things that we can explore here. So I've got I've got, well, Joel, I see your hand up. We'll take you first, and then we'll go with JK. Joel?
Is this the other Joel or me?
You.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So with the question I had that has to do with language or speech in the form of communication, I'd also like, I want to say, on one hand, our vocabulary and our language is also fundamental for us to communicate, but I'm also wanting to point to so many other different methods of not just communication, but we can understand ourselves and the place in the world through like body language, through art, through instrumental music. I forget what the psychological definition is. How much of communication between one person to another is just, it's nonverbal. It's just through looking in someone's eyes, body language. There's so much about communication that I'd like to think that has nothing to do with language itself. Is so much of it is intuitive, so to speak, right? But I can think of so many different ways of communication without having to say anything in a lot of ways. So, all done.
Well, it's a question I think that we should consider here. It may be pretty fundamental to the ideas that Plato's trying to get across in Phaedrus. And maybe if I could put what you said in a little bit of a different light, in understanding what you said about art, being one form of expression, physical expression, artistic expression, written expression, which we'll deal with that Thamus and Theuth legend that Plato puts in the Phaedrus shortly. But I'm wondering, without speech, would we be able to understand the meaning, or would we be able to form meaning of images if we didn't have speech? So say we lived in a world, I'm just imagining a world where Da Vinci drew the Mona Lisa or painted the Mona Lisa, but none of us spoke. None of us had the capacity of speaking. So this character comes along, name is Da Vinci, paints the Mona Lisa, and we would all look at the Mona Lisa, but we would never be able to speak to each other. And how would we derive any sort of meaning from that? I'm just wondering, it's a bit of a thought experiment, but, is speech, is having this kind of back and forth exchange maybe the only way that we can find meaning? So thoughts on that, based on your own experience and observed experience, what do people think? JK and then Jane.
You include mathematics as also a form of speech, or
it's maybe or a form of expression, certainly. A form of expression, and maybe we can maybe take it back to the question that Joel asked at the last episode as well. Is there a difference between teaching mathematics and doing mathematics as a science? So I'll just throw that in. But JK, continue.
Yeah. So you talked about Da Vinci, and isn't art also a form of expression of? It's a kind of a representation that we rely on, and then is expressed in a work of art. So language is kind of a kind of representation, isn't it? It's a we rely on certain symbols and to put together these various symbols to express. So yeah. So I wanted to touch on the idea of speech and these kind of representations in terms of a rational understanding of control and building a framework, a system that is that we can rely on for that kind of control. And so basically it's really control of the what is unpredictable in nature itself, and because there are all these forces that are trying to gain control of us, and someone mentioned the dreams, right? Dreams, and that is in the unconscious, and so there are these unconscious forces and symbols and so forth that are there. And so it seems that Plato was maybe right about maybe these kind of forms are already there in us that we just don't know about. But for him, the forms are rational. In our modern day, we have the notion of collective unconscious, in depth psychology of Jung and Joseph Campbell. And so these kinds of, forces from the unconscious, are not necessarily, maybe, I don't know, could they be also rational? There is some rationality to them, but they're mixing with the other, with the passions and so forth that could also, affect us and influence us. So, like the person who's the chariot, it may not be in control, as much control as he thinks he is. But if you believe in rationality, then maybe you can overcome all the forces of nature. And I guess science is going along that path of trying to control everything. So what was it, Gudel's notion that you can't have a complete system and be consistent, right? But I mean, I guess we're always trying to, right?
Yeah, I like the way that you phrase that, controlling what is unpredictable in nature, and then you ended by talking about Gödel's incompleteness theorems and the idea that there is this incompleteness maybe in the universe, and maybe that's what Gödel's mathematical conclusion led to. And certainly what we know, and I've spoken before about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which governs physics, and so physics is inherently unpredictable. And I think we've talked before about how that's actually probably a good thing for us, because otherwise life might be pretty static and predictable, and uninteresting as a result. But so now we have this interesting intersection of rational and irrational, commensurable and incommensurable in our lives. And it's the soul's challenge and maybe joy at the same time of trying to figure all of this out. So in terms of figuring it out, Jane, what do you think?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. My computer stopped working, so I had to connect via phone. So I just want to be sure that everything's working. Okay, so a lot of great things were said, and I want to address a couple of points that were mentioned. First of all, I think, James, you mentioned this about the individual and society. I recently attended a couple of great meetups, and when I really gave it some thought, I think I came to realize that I can't imagine if we move from the realm of pure theory into trying to imagine what it would look like practically. I can't imagine an individual actually surviving in any way or form without a society. And even if a person was able to, when I say individual, I mean someone who has both a soul and a physical body. So if they were able to survive for a very long time without any other individuals, without any other society, I think that individual would stop being an individual and turn into something else. And that the concept of an individual only has sense, meaning, and definition only within the society. So I would imagine that definitely speech is a very important part of that. It is, I guess, one of the things that makes us human. I mean, animals do communicate as well, and we could technically call it, I guess, a sort of form of speech, but it's definitely not the same thing as a human being. And someone else mentioned, when we communicate with someone, it's definitely not only about the verbal. And if we look into communication theory, there's a ratio of 40 to 60, but I don't remember 40 to 60, one's verbal signs, the other one is nonverbal. So basically we could say half of the things that we're half of the information that we're getting from the person we're speaking to is actually not just speech. It's a lot of the other things. A lot of it is maybe subconscious, maybe it's the tone of the voice, or what the person's doing, how they're sitting, and there's it's a whole lot of things, but speech definitely plays a part in that. And in terms of what directs the soul, I find that the subconscious is a very interesting thing. And I think that's, if we're talking about like Plato and Socrates, for Socrates, I think that was his daemon, I believe it's called, like this thing that would tell him, well, it never told him what to do, but it told him what never to do. And I always interpret that as some form of like subconsciousness that sort of comes on to Socrates, and he sort of decides what not to do based on what he's hearing or seeing in this like spirit type of thing. And like personally in my life, I've realized that a lot of the things come from this sort of unknown source, and these decisions can be totally irrational based on what I know. But if I go with that thing that I got, I usually end up making the best choice, which has been really weird. And it's weird to say, but a lot of the more important decisions I've made based on irrational grounds, and it has turned out better than the ones that I took going against those I don't know if it's like feelings or anything, but like those sort of, I guess, subconscious decisions that come upon me. And I don't view that as something supernatural. I think that there's just, especially nowadays, there's so much information, so much stuff going on. There's no way the conscious could ever comprehend all of it. So we have the subconscious, which does a lot of it. It's just that we're maybe not intact with it. Why that is, I'm not sure. But anyway, I'm going to try to wrap it up. And the last thing I'd like to say is, if we're looking at that, I guess, sort of dichotomy of like the infinite and the finite, what is and what is becoming, I view speech as something that is becoming, that is a sort of kind of like a shadow of the ideas, which are what is infinite. Well, that's at least the way that I interpret it within like the world of Plato, I guess. That's up. Oh, and the last thing that I wanted to say is, someone was mentioning harmony and destruction as something that are things that are not able to come together. So they're kind of like opposites, I guess, in a way. But I view actually some forms of destructions as a part of harmony, if that makes any sense. So basically, we're destroying all the time. It could actually be productive destruction. For example, when we're like destroying, I don't know, in the sense of like, I don't know, politics, we're destroying one political system so a new one is reborn. And sort of, if we look at nature, destruction and actually violence and suffering, it's all part of nature. So when we're saying to live in harmony with nature, that harmony, at least to me, it's still like encompasses sort of both destruction and violence, because we see that in nature all the time. And so, yeah, that's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jane. And, the way that you talked about the individual having the definition only in the context of society really made me think, and you raised so many good points in what you said, that I think we need to explore that and to understand, again, I'm just thinking back, if I were to see Da Vinci's painting of the Mona Lisa, but I was incapable of speech, and so that there was no communication channels between me and any of the other 7.8 billion people on this planet. None of us could speak to each other. Yeah, we would have lots of forms of expression. We would have art, we would have mathematics, we would have all of this. Maybe the expression would be extremely limited because we were not able to speak to each other, but we could still have forms of expression. But, would we have meaning? And I think you talked about this. Individual has definition, and maybe we could say individual has meaning in the context of society, and what's the communication channel that establishes that meaning? Is it just simply the expression, or is it talking about the expression? And maybe that's a point that that Plato's trying to make in that opening line again that we started looking at today at 271D, that the nature of speech is in fact to direct the soul, which is what Socrates is saying. Is it directing with meaning? Maybe is what he's trying to imply here. I don't know.
Hey, James.
So let's explore that. Yeah,
James.
Yeah.
You have to excuse me. I can't use the raise hand button because I'm the
yeah,
host.
by all means, Ada.
I know we have raised hands, but I'd like to just quickly share on why I work with children. I just wanted to share all these cute triangles that I just made right now. So even not about, we don't even have to start talking about the speech yet, but we are not sure if we see or think the same thing while we are looking at the pictures. So not about the words yet. So these are all triangles and they all look different. And we don't know. I don't know which one you see. And you don't know which ones I see, but they are all different versions of the same shape. So we are not even sure of the shapes that we think we see. So the words are just another thing. I just wanted to bring that. And thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, James, can I jump in here? I can't raise a hand neither.
Oh, yes. Sorry, Greg. Yeah.
So
let's take Greg, and then we've got a few people with their hands up. So, Greg?
Okay, lots being said, and I just come back to what, Regina was, he pointed out the word logos. And the logos really is, I did some tracing back in terms of the epistemology of logos lately. And I can even look into the original text, Greek text for Plato's dialogues, and find that in Plato, the original word, the Greek word for reason was logos. The logos was a reason. But then logos as a word, at the Homer's time was just a speech. So the very word of a speech and the logos, they are the same word at some point in Greek, but that diverged later on. At Plato's time, the word actually means reason. But at Homer's time, the concept of reason did not exist. Logos was just a speech. And in context, so we talk about, I think that what happened is that logos was remain as a speech in common people. But philosophers also use logos to mean reason. And the beginning of that was, I think it was Heraclitus. He first, used the logos to mean some kind of word order. And from that point, the order, logic, the reason start to surface. And by the Plato's time, and the philosopher come to use logos as a reason. And I find that if we consider speech as a general thing, that it's because everything goes with speech. Reason is a part of speech too. So there is a kind of a less irrational speech and a more rational speech. The rational speech goes with more sort of logic of things, but the irrational speech is emotional, subconscious, everything in between. So I think when we talk to speech, it encompasses all these elements of irrationality and rationality, and that rationality is naturally embedded in the speech. Anyway, I find that the word logos really has a lot of very rich meaning and its history as well. So anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. And sorry, the hand raise isn't working for you, but whenever you feel like speaking, Greg, just let me know and certainly let you in. So we'll. But you really made me think actually there with that. That because we talked last time about how you translate words, and the translation is according to meaning. So one translation of logos might mean a specific thing now, but I think you pointed out a very important thing, which is perhaps the original meaning of logos and this idea of reason. And again, this idea in the first part of Phaedrus of bringing things into a reasoned unity as maybe one of the tasks, one of the challenges, but maybe also one of the joys of the soul. And then thinking also, again, back to Timaeus 28a, is that the way that you comprehend that which always is but never becomes is through a reasoned account. And so maybe it's in finding those reasons that that's really an important part of speech, is to find the reasons. And you made me think, actually, just I don't know what it was something in what you said that made me think of what I've been trying to express for, I think, the past hour or so, is this idea that maybe speech is a two-way communication channel. So maybe this difference between expression, James mentioned in his chat post, about dreams being an expression. Somebody else mentioned about mathematics being a form of expression. Somebody else mentioned art being a form of expression. So we have all of these expressions, but are they one-way expressions? And then is speech a two-way expression channel? And maybe that's a fundamental difference. So I just thought I would throw that out when the thought occurred to me. We'll go to Reggie and then to Joel. Reggie?
Yeah, it's very intriguing conversation. I look at it all at a whole, like the logos would be, it's just a word, and a word is obviously is a vibration. But you got to remember, there's languages of imagery, which is dreams, imagery in terms of expressions, language of emotions. I mean, just imagine if we couldn't actually say words, we could still communicate with each other, or deaf people can communicate with each other with sign language. So language of that. And the higher vibrations would be probably language of light. There's information obviously going through like fiber optics, tons of information, and we're communicating with imageries of computer science, the actual screen. And so that's imagery, language of imagery. All this probably, again, you want to, if I were to be screaming here, it would be very disharmonious. But you want all this type of vibrations, this electrical signals that are going around, to be, because if they're not in harmony, because that's my big word today. I don't know why I'm stuck on harmony, but if they're not in harmony, people get repelled, people push off, and basically we're conditioned to be in harmony. And then we are conditioned also to say it's okay to hurt one another, okay to go to war, okay to do whatever we do to animals. And you get into a higher philosophy of thinking in terms of, so we're raised with certain imagery, certain vibration, certain language. It's hard to reevaluate it all once you've been conditioned into this reasoning of, and then once you, big part of this is meditation. You let a lot of this go and rethink it all, which is very difficult in today's world with so much information being projected upon us. And then obviously when we dream, a lot of that is reflected through our dreams. What we see visually, we actually, when we sleep at night and close our eyes, or even meditate, we reflect all that. It's hard through the meditation to let things go like that, to let all this, they call it the monkey mind or the crazy mind, and to calm it down, to listen to the peaceful things in the world, to listen to the nature, to listen to the trees, to listen, to look at each other, not say anything, and to express that oneness, that happiness, that love that's so missed in this world today. Thank you.
Thank you. And, I think actually what you said about, kind of going into the mind and finding, these potentially greater truths leads well into the kind of first reading that I wanted to do today. And that was that legend of Thamus and Theuth, and, being able to establish your own meaning in things, I think is a very important message in this dialogue of Plato's. You mentioned harmony, and here it is right on the screen in front of you. That's the section. So Eva, if you would just drop just there's a line or two above this. Actually, just go back up to the triangle, the first page there, Eva, and it's actually right at the top. There's the reading actually that mentions harmony, and there it was right on the screen. So maybe I'll just quickly read this. It's from 268 E in Phaedrus, and it's they would react more like a musician confronted by a man who thought he had mastered harmony because he was able to produce the highest and lowest notes on his strings. A musician would not say fiercely, "You stupid man, you are out of your mind." As befits his calling, he would speak more gently, "My friend." Though that too is necessary for understanding harmony, someone who has gotten as far as you have, may still know absolutely nothing about the subject. What you know is what it's necessary to learn before you study harmony, but not harmony itself. And the idea of harmony here, the contrast is being made between the person who knows the upper and lower limits of a musical scale, but not how to bring everything in between together. And actually, what you just said, Reggie, about harmony, just here it was right on the screen. I just thought I would read that because I think it's so important. That idea of, notwithstanding that there are limits, we need to know what's between the limits and how to make meaning and sense out of them. So I just wanted to bring that reading in because you mentioned harmony again. We'll go to Joel and then Jean and JK. Joel?
All right. Yes, please. So I want to dive right into that thought experiment, James, you used about the Da Vinci painting, and if everybody was like deaf and mute and couldn't be able to speak whatsoever, would we still be able to derive meaning from a painting? And I would actually like to argue absolutely. Like if I woke up deaf and mute, of course that would be horrible, but I wouldn't take from that, okay, everything else as far as experience goes is meaningless. I would take the further step in saying, if I would render speech completely useless altogether if it wasn't justified through actions. Like imagine if you and I had no idea what dancing was and we couldn't dance, and I tried to describe to you what dancing was like, but I didn't show you what it was and you never saw it. It would be completely meaningless to you. Like I would argue that some of the most powerful experiences I've experienced in my whole life were just speechless moments, breathtaking. Like I tried to describe to you like the very first sunset and sunrise I saw in Hawaii for the first time, like that, just describing that to you in words for whatever reason tarnishes the memory. It's like, it's just something that words don't do it justice whatsoever. So like I would argue speech is the most useful way. It has the most utility of being able to get you to relate to what I'm feeling or what I've experienced. But if it's not backed up by actions, then I would render speech useless altogether. There was something else that I wanted to say, but I can't remember it. But yeah, I love the Da Vinci painting part.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think it's a thought experiment that we can continue to explore. I mean, I hear what you're saying in terms of, if you didn't speak and you couldn't hear, it doesn't, what I'm not trying to say is that would invalidate the experience, but I think maybe it's the lack of a two-way communication channel that would kind of reduce the experience, maybe. Is that we're not able to trade ideas, for example, on, what's the emotion on her face in that painting and what does it represent and what are all of the possible things that it could represent, because each one of us, and I think it was Jane who said earlier that each individual is part of the greater whole of society, and it's that being part of that greater whole that maybe renders meaning to the individual. And so, because my experiences in life are very limited, in the context of the experiences of 7.8 billion people on this planet, my experiences are naturally only limited by where I can go and how much I can do during my waking hours. But when we all start trading these experiences through speech in this two-way communication channel, it kind of broadens the depth of the meaning. And so maybe there's something to be said there. I don't know, but let's see what others think. Jean, I see your hand up, and then JK. Jean?
Yes, I totally agree with what Joel said, but I want to say, add the other half of it, which may sound like I'm totally disagreeing with Joel, but it's just the other half of the story. So going back to Mona Lisa picture, I think without speech, and I'm not talking about just the communication of all sort of forms, and I am talking about human language and human speech. So I'll just use the word speech. Without speech and human interaction of a speech act, I don't think Mona Lisa picture is even possible to begin with. I think because we have a speech, I think the picture and meaning exists, or it is possible, because we're just forged out of the society. So it feels like we have individual, we have self, but I think that it's built out of this sense of self, sense of meaning, sense of what I am, sense of what you mean and what the other person mean. It all, I think it is built entirely, or at least partly, because of the speech, human language and speech. So you are built now. And that's how it can even, we can even talk about this kind of pictures, because going back to soul as a public thing, there is this resonance with me, to where I think there is something to where two-way interaction, two-way, or even multiple people, or I'm not just expressing one thing, but also immediate feedback of the other person's speech back, facial expression, and together there is some kind of a synergy building and some kind of a swirling happening and momentum happening, and then that happening gets faster and faster, and more people join in, where there is this emergence of some incredible thing that other animals could not have, because they didn't have the human language, they didn't have the human speech. I'm not saying that it is inferior, superior. I'm just saying that it is just human specific thing, that we have this speech and we have this incredible social cooperation, co-understanding. And I think in a way, it's even a building block of a human consciousness. Other animals probably have consciousness to a certain level, but because we have this damn thing called speech, I think our consciousness is just the building block. We just hit the lottery of a building block of all this consciousness thing, to where it became the synergy, and it became this way. And then from 10,000 years ago, writing started, and we have this accumulation of this consciousness and this two-way, multiple way, not just multiple people at the same synchronistic same time, but even we can accumulate from thousands of years ago, to where now we don't even know what to do with all this information. So this two-way, multiple way accumulation, all this speech and information, I think that actually have built who we are and what meaning is, and then this meaning has become such an essence of human existence. Thank you.
And can I jump in here?
Yeah, Greg, go ahead.
This the speech, and then early on, Joe, regarding the imagery, and then the action, and the speech. I think there's something to do with the essence of this speech. At the end of the day, is in the concepts, and then the concepts imagery come back to your diagram here regarding the how many triangles there, like a general and then particular. It really come down to general and particular. And we have a particular concepts, which we say the sunset, that sunset, and then the general concept of sunset. So we I think that we need both in order to know and understand. And that's why we differentiate from animal. Without those concepts, we're just animal. But we have a concept. This picture in its meaning are enhanced. I think that this picture or imagery or whatever do have a meaning to animal. They have a cognition, but they don't have a concepts. We only human have, and because of the concepts, and depends on the richness of concept, and depends on how they are related with the concepts, that adds the rich meaning to our human life. So at the end of the day, I think there's the general and the particulars. The particulars are particular sunset, the imagery, that the thing we feel and touch every day. But from that, we arise to the general form, which is concept. And the two are connected. And they interact in each way and gradually enrich our understanding and appreciation of what we have.
Well, thank you, Greg. And I think both you, Greg, and Jean, who spoke before, I think really made a good combination together, because what I got from Jean was this idea of this idea of contrasts and synergy. Jean used that word, synergy. The idea of these contrasts and synergy coming together to form meaning within the whole. So the one individual contrasting and having synergy with another individual makes that kind of whole construction of meaning, and meaning is constructed maybe at a society level rather than a individual level, or at least it's transmitted at a society rather than individual level. And then it made me think of, again, what Reggie was saying about vibration. This idea of having synergy, and if I think of myself as a vibration, am I vibrating at the same frequency as you, or in the differences of our frequencies, as we each vibrate a little bit differently, do we find some sort of meaningful contrast in that? Very, very interesting kind of idea there that we can maybe explore. I just wanted to raise a point too, again, going back to 249C that we discussed 2 weeks ago in that first part of, or the end of the first part of Phaedrus, this idea that the idea of the soul recollecting the things that it saw when it was traveling with God, when it disregarded the things we now call real, and lifted up its head to see what is truly real instead. So those words, and we didn't get to discuss that last time, but this difference between real and truly real, and so maybe, Greg, what you just said about the particulars, the particular specifics that we each have to deal with in our daily lives, those are real, maybe to us, but what is truly real the kind of general form of all of those specific things. So if we were to follow back all of those specific things that we deal with in our daily lives, what general forms or general ideas could we tie them back to? This idea, or this concept idea that you brought forth, Greg, I think is very important. Is language what gives us the ability to deal with concepts as opposed to the particulars, but gives us the idea, the ability to deal with general concepts. So I like that. Thank you both very much for building on each other's comments there. We'll go to JK.
Yeah, there's only take the idea of this concept that you're talking about which is what language is, and language is a kind of like a system for learning how to abstract, from the concrete. And that's how the language comes about, is this kind of a public sharing of these abstractions. And that kind of, abstraction is, of course, sort of what gives us meaning, a sense of meaning. The ultimate kind of meaning would be, Socrates and Plato's idea of the soul, and that comes about by this, the practice of, creating these, super abstractions of who we are and so forth, and what never changes, and what is being, and what is the one and the same, what is the one and the same. So it's really how they used the language, to derive meaning. And whereas at that time, before, maybe a little bit before, it was Heraclitus who emphasized not the meaning of not that kind of meaning of how things, the sameness or the oneness, or he also talked about the oneness, but the idea of change, that things that are different, constantly being different, and for him, the understanding of logos was more how it was originally, understood, And so logos for Heraclitus, meant it's the understanding of how things change and they're not the same, and the sense of oneness is the oneness of being and becoming. And so Plato maybe emphasized the idea of the oneness as a being that does not change, the sameness. And for him, that's what meaning is or was, right? And in our present day, we have all kinds of different philosophers that came to the idea of understanding language as how you use it, right? Well, one way or the other, and how the people in the public, share this kind of understanding of language and its meaning by the customary use of the different terms in language. So it really comes down to how you use it and whether you emphasize the being or the becoming, and maybe there are some philosophers that are able to understand meaning ultimately as the process of being and becoming, which is, I think that's, philosophy is always trying to come to, I think, to incorporate these two divergent senses of what life, is, right? Being and becoming. Things change, and also they in some sense remain the same. And so I think so language and meaning they kind of go together, and depends on how you use it.
Well, that's great, and again, that brings us back to the point that we talked about in the last episode about meaning being derived in use, and I like, the kind of melding together of being and becoming that you use, because it goes back to what one of the participants said at the beginning of this episode, which was, or the question that was asked at the beginning of this episode, which was, did the ancient Greeks use the word infinity, but maybe they used it in the context of being, at least what you just, the way that you just described being as the kind of eternal is. And if I think back again to Timaeus 28a, maybe being is that which always is but never becomes, and that's in contrast to that which always becomes but never is. And so maybe that part about that which always is but never becomes is really equivalent to infinity.
James, can I add something here?
Yeah.
Isn't it about like what we master as group of people, the language and communication? Like a year ago, this online communication was like, look at us, we're all masters on online communication. And we all had to go through with that as the whole world who can use internet at least. So I think that shows a big thing. And because I work with teenagers and children, I'm so curious to see maybe 10 years after now, the kids who were babies who are born this year, how will they see communication? How will they communicate? Many of us, we never met in face. And we know, like Jane, while you were talking about, like, sometimes you feel like what's in you, what is like, what was not taught to you, but what is speaking, something speaking in you sounds right, makes more sense than the things that you learn, maybe virtue. And I'm now curious, like, just like we are connecting with in a wireless or like internet connection, I'm wondering is there a way that our virtues or our souls could be connecting too? And maybe if we master this, could we communicate without any devices? I mean, how can that? How can we use that? And I know it's possible, but just we don't know about it, or we were not trained into it. We're not used to it. So before writing was or publishing was this active or this much used in the past, like people would just memorize the things they heard right away. So I really can't understand that because I never experienced that. But now we are all like online. We are all online people now. We know a lot about that. So I think that's experimental too.
And certainly you raised the point about this being kind of a new type of communication channel, Eva. And, a little over a year ago, we were doing these meetings in person. We would each have to travel to a specified location at a specified time. We would go into a room, have to locate a room to hold the event in. And then all of that changed. And then we formed this kind of new communication channel. But we're still using speech, ultimately to understand each other. But, how will this evolve over time? We don't know. But I think you raised a very important point too, also, Eva, in terms of the changes over time in the way that we use this two-way speech communication channel, and the changes in meaning over time. And it's actually a good segue into the reading that I wanted to do. So maybe, Eva, I would just ask you if you could put up the reading that's on the third page. It's labeled Roman numeral 2. And we can, if I would have a volunteer maybe to read this. This is the legend of Thamus and Theuth, from 275a to 275b in Phaedrus. And
James, could I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
I think it's connected to the comment that Eva just made. I just got a thought. This change of communication and the internet age, and in light of the thing called memory, and I think indeed it's fascinating that in a way that the variety of ways we can communicate, but also I think very importantly is really this memory thing. I felt that so much information we have, and in the past we tried to rely on our heart memory, but these days it's not necessary, but also it's not possible. Not possible that just too much information. Not necessary is that the tools that we have allow us to do that. It's at our fingertip. It's almost like the cell phone and internet. It's our extended memory. It's just a little bit delay. But given what Elon Musk just did, he just made a speech, I think, announcement saying that they succeed in direct communication between electronic and the brain, and it's foreseeable in the near future indeed that we not only have that direct essential memory from our whatever we think, whatever we remember, connected to a piece of computer. So everything that happened in the past will be instantly available to the brain. On the one hand, on the other hand, because it's a connected computer, therefore it's connected to all humanity. So there's a public soul is becoming a truly a public soul that how many billion people we have, that all the souls are connected to a single soul to be able to think at the same time. It's amazing. just a thought occurred to me.
I love what you just said, Greg, and certainly what you said about the computer, the electronic or the digital technology connecting us all, and whether it's a direct, neural link connection, such as what Elon Musk is looking to establish, or whether it's something else. I think certainly, I've spoken before about quantum computing, and actually the diagram on my screen behind me, which is the tetrahedron in a sphere, is actually very similar, has striking similarities to the outline of a qubit, the quantum bit, or called a qubit, that will operate in superposition in a quantum computer. And this is something that I've continued to follow, this whole quantum computing development. And certainly when the quantum computer is introduced, there will be a very fast and vast proliferation of information. And it's a question of, is that information, what do we do with that information? What meaning do we make of that information? How do we want to communicate to each other? How do we want to establish that? How do we want to maintain that two-way communication channel when all of this information is coming at us? And it makes me think of our episode on the Meno, where we talked about knowledge having to be tied down. That was a point that Socrates made right at the end. of the Meno when he talked about made the analogy to the statues of Daedalus, and the statues of Daedalus look so lifelike and they could almost run away unless they're tied down, and he equated that to knowledge. So how are we going to tie knowledge down in this kind of emerging reality that we're getting into? And so I just wanted to introduce this reading, and I don't know if I would have a volunteer. I called on Joel before to volunteer, and I don't know if he's up for it, if somebody else would volunteer. Just while I wait for somebody to come forward and volunteer, I just wanted to introduce this particular reading with a point that Socrates makes at 263a, right at the end of 263a. And Socrates says, and this is again this idea of the speech directing the soul that we started our discussion today with. So in the next sort of half hour that's remaining, I just wanted to kind of get into this idea of the difference between remembering and reminding, which you touched on, Greg. And so I wanted to introduce it with with what Socrates says at 263a. He says, but what happens when we say the word just or the word good? Doesn't each one of us go in a different direction? Don't we differ with one another and even with ourselves? So what is our concept of just and of good, is what he's asking. Now, is this something that is written down somewhere in the universal record? Is there any, single library that we can go to and open a book that says this forever for all times is justice, this forever and all times is goodness? If such a book exists, we haven't found it yet, right? So we continue to argue about the meaning of these things over time. And that relates, I think, to what Eva said about kind of meaning shifting over time. And so I just wanted to, because I think that was a powerful point that Socrates makes at 263a. And it kind of leads into this part about this reading that I've got up here on the screen, or that Eva's got up on the screen, this distinction between remembering and reminding and the soul's inward journey. And it makes me think of the question that Joel G. asked in the last episode: is there a distinction between a teacher of mathematics and a scientist mathematician? And maybe that there's something in here that I kind of mentioned, I think, in our last episode that may relate to this distinction between remembering and reminding. And so I'm just wondering if someone would be kind enough to just read these two paragraphs on the legend of Thamus and Theuth. So here we have Thamus is the king of Egypt, and Theuth is the Egyptian god of writing, measuring, and calculation. And so in this legend, Plato's bringing Theuth into the king's presence, and they're having a discussion. And so I'm just wondering if someone would be kind enough to read this for me. Joel, thank you.
Now, I tried to eliminate the confusion by using Joe, but you do mean me, do you?
I do, yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, 275A to 275B. Now, the king of all Egypt at that time was Thamus, who lived in the great city in the upper region that the Greeks called Egyptian Thebes. Thamus they call Ammon. Theuth came to exhibit his arts to him and urged him to disseminate them to all the Egyptians. Thamus asked him about the usefulness of each art, and while Theuth was explaining it, Thamus praised him for whatever he thought was right in his explanations and criticized him for whatever he thought was wrong. The story goes that Thamus said much to Theuth, both for and against each art, which it would take too long to repeat. But when they came to writing, Theuth said, "O king, here is something that once learned will make the Egyptians wiser and will improve their memory. I have discovered a potion for memory and for wisdom." Thamus, however, replied, "O most expert Theuth, one man can give birth to the elements of an art, but only another can judge how they benefit or harm those who will use them. And now, since you are the father of writing, your affection for it has made you describe its effect as the opposite of what they really are. In fact, it will introduce forgetfulness into the soul of those who learn it. They will not practice using their memory because they will put their trust in writing, which is external and depends on signs that belong to others, instead of trying to remember from the inside completely on their own. You have not discovered a potion for remembering, but for reminding. You provide your students with the appearance of wisdom, but not with its reality. Your invention will enable them to hear many things without being properly taught, and they will imagine that they have come to know much, while for the most part they will know nothing. And they will be difficult to get along with, since they will merely appear to be wise instead of really being so.
Thank you very much, Joel. That's read with great meaning. Thank you. I think it kind of really brings you into that room where, where this legendary discussion between Thamus and Theuth is going on. And I'm just wondering, what people think here about, was Thamus wise in what he said? I'm seeing some wisdom in it, but I don't know what others think here, and this goes to, this general theme that goes through Plato's works about kind of maybe the dangers of writing sometimes. Writing is good. It's a form of expression. I don't think he ever says you should never write. But I think he's placing the idea of this dialectic or dialogue process as being really above the process of writing. And he uses this distinction between remembering and reminding. And maybe this takes us back to this idea of a general form of speech and what people think of this distinction between remembering and reminding, whether it's in that question that Joel G asked last time, is the math teacher helping us to remember, or is the math teacher helping us to helping to remind us? And what's the difference between remembering and reminding? I think it's such a fundamental idea that is trying to be conveyed in this dialogue. And I'm just wondering what people think. First of all, are there dangers in writing, as Thamus is saying here? He points to some clear dangers in writing if we rely on it exclusively, perhaps. And so, what do you think? Is there wisdom in what he's saying? Is there wisdom in Thamus's advice here?
So, James, I think I'm not sure about the answer for that, but I want to bring another challenge. When you say remembering and reminding, the difference between these two concepts, what do we think about what is the difference between wisdom and knowledge? And are they connected? We remember things, we are reminded things. We know things, but does everything we know affects us? Just because we know, does that mean that it's part of our wisdom? Or am I just carrying that megabytes or sources of knowledge with me, but they are not processing in my thinking? So I think they are related.
A very fundamental question, I think, Eva, the difference between wisdom and knowledge, and certainly something that comes through a lot of Plato's dialogues. And we saw that in the Meno again. Maybe, this idea that knowledge has to be tied down before it can even be considered, in the context of wisdom is something that's important. And how do we tie down knowledge if it's not in speech and testing limits?
Just a very short, if we really want to be wiser, we'll have to know less. And that's chaotic, scary. So,
yeah. Well, or maybe, maybe it's not, maybe the word less, we could replace that with the word general, and to take it to what maybe Plato was saying in the first part of Phaedrus with this idea of the general forms. Maybe we have to stop thinking about all of those individual particulars, which are just going to, multiply many, many times over when the quantum computer comes out, for example. There would be so many data points out there, so many more data points than we're used to dealing with now. How are we going to generalize them? So how are we going to take them back to the kind of core underlying principle, back to the general form? And this is where I really think the power of Plato's theory of form starts to come through, is this and the power of the human mind in terms of being able to generalize these ideas. So no, thank you. You raise a very good and important point. And I want to go here to James and to welcome James for joining us. And James, what do you think?
Well, thank you. I think that writing allows you to focus your thoughts more clearly, get a gut reaction as to what your thoughts are. When you write, you put it down on paper and you kind of reconsider what you're thinking about. I think it allows you to focus and critique yourself. And so I think there's a real advantage to writing in that it allows for clarification. I think there's also a danger, and that when people start writing to a great extent, they sometimes think they know more than they really do. So they mistake their opinion for knowledge or wisdom. So I think that it's a two-way issue, both exaggerating your own confidence in what you're thinking, but also clarifying your thoughts at the same way. That's my thought.
Yeah. No, I think I'm just writing a note actually on what you said. This idea that writing allows focus, I think, is a very important point. And I like the way you said that, but then also, that risk of generating overconfidence. And I was just thinking about that quote from 263A that I read just before we did that reading, and this idea of just and good. If somebody wrote down a definition of just and good 2,400 years ago in Plato's time, what would they have written in their definitions? And if we weren't allowed to adjust those definitions since then, would we be stuck? Would we be trapped in that paradigm now still? Or having this ability of this two-way communication through dialogue and dialectic and speech, are we allowed to kind of change the meaning, adjust the meaning of things over time, but still go back to that general form of justice and good, whatever that is? We're all seeking that general form, but nobody's told us what that form is. So thank you for that. We'll go to, actually, we'll start with Jose, who hasn't spoken before, and then we'll go to Joel and JK. So Jose, welcome.
Hi, James. I wanted to draw a parallel of this myth of the Egyptian king and the god. Like right now, I have the feeling that in some parts of the education system, they are teaching the kids how to use Google rather than how to learn things. So kids now, they feel that they know everything because they can Google, but in reality, they don't know anything because they didn't learn things like with dialectic. So in the old days, I can say, you used to learn things more in dialectic. You used to read, you have to have a teacher, you discuss, you read several articles, several viewpoints, and you really learn things like that because you type up and all these things that Plato says. But now, they feel like, I can Google something. So I know, but I don't have any context, any reference, and if Google one day is wrong, they are wrong as well. Okay, this is my point.
Oh, it's an important point. I mean, there are forms, like if you Google a site that has somebody speaking, yes, you will hear speech, but it's that one-way communications as opposed to that two-way communication. So you don't get, it was Reggie was talking before about vibrations. You're not getting that ability to vibrate with each other and share some sort of find together some sort of harmony. Are we better in speaking? Is it like, that example in the Meno where at the very beginning, Meno says, yeah, I know what virtue is. Virtue is this, that, and the other thing. And then by the end of it, Meno is totally confused, doesn't know what virtue is, because in the process of speaking has discovered what he doesn't know. And maybe that's the important part about speaking, is that we can go into things thinking that we know, but when we speak to others and realize that varying contrast and we're looking at different limits, maybe we don't know what we think we know. And maybe that's an important thing that we need to discover in this technological age. We'll go to Joel and then JK.
So it's not an answer, but it's just a quick joke. Can you remind me real quick, James, what was the question, the job of a teacher to the students? The teacher was supposed to do one of two things. Was it like to remind, or what was the other one? Can you?
Well, the contrast in this section that we just read in 275A to 275B is making a contrast between remembering and reminding. And in it, he says, remembering is something that you do internally, whereas reminding is something where you're taking external information and you're reminding people of what the external information says. So remembering comes from within, reminding comes from without. That was the legend of Thamus and Theuth that we just read.
Okay, well, I chuckled a little bit when you read that, because I don't have an answer to that yet, but I remember saying to myself, like, it depends on the teacher, right? Because if I can remember back in high school and college, like if like a class I went through in biology or chemistry, you could put a gun to my head an hour after the lecture and I couldn't tell you what I remembered. But if I watched like a great course episode of Sean Carroll, Brian Greene, or Brian Cox about the multi-universe, Roger Penrose's cyclic model, quarks, I'm like running around trying to like talk about that with somebody, and then my girlfriend would like be like, call James or Eva, like to like bug them about this, right? Like I want to pass that on to somebody else, but it depends on the teacher, right? So yeah, I couldn't, just a quick little joke there.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And certainly, the idea that the soul can be forgetful, and believe me, as I age, I realize that that's certainly the case with me. That when we're faced with so much data in the world now, that it is hard to remember all of this, right? And so I think what you just said, Joel, is sometimes that when you remember things or derive meaning internally, it sticks with you longer, and the soul isn't going to forget it. And the forgetful soul is something that Thamus is talking about at 275A to 275B. JK, what do you think?
This idea of remembering and reminding seems like the remembering is what you remember within, and it's like that kind of remembering has to do with the collective memories that you have, from yourself, but then, and then correspondingly through writing, as opposed to speech, you are reminded, by the collective without, that's outside of you. And for me, they kind of like, are contrasting at that same time. It's a little bit paradoxical that that's something that you could do, individually in writing, where you focus on your an individual process is derived from a public a method, the language that you learn from the public. But what is also whereas for Plato the process of dialogue and so forth is a process of remembering your collective wisdom from within.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it makes me think of it's that, I think you just tied it to what James said in terms of the idea of writing maybe allows for individual focus, but in terms of the collective meaning of it, we still need some sort of two-way communication channel, and so I think that's an important point. We'll go to Moshe and
can I jump in, James, here?
Yeah, we'll go to Greg and then Moshe.
Okay, thank you. I look at this remembering and reminding thing, the story, and I find it's fascinating from the mindset. At the time that they probably don't have much to remember compared to our days, and probably remembering, and then the language was, they don't have really anything writing. So So the ability to remember and the skill to remember probably is ranked very high, and that's why there's a pre-assumption there. If you anything that it does not help remembering is bad. So there's already prejudgment there. So that's why that and then the deemed remembering, reminding is not as good a thing, and yet all this human development indicating that we start to develop more and more technologies regarding reminding. And even another point is here, I found that Socrates himself, and historians has been asking the question that why Socrates didn't leave anything written down, and all he's saying has to go through Plato. I remember reading one of the dialogues, I forgot which one. Socrates actually saying that himself, he doesn't like to write down because that will reduce his ability to remember. So one of the reasons that Socrates didn't write anything down is he didn't like writing, and he want to just in that way then he will not lose the ability to remembering, and that's why Socrates remember all these stories very well. He throughout this dialogue that everything happened in the history, who was named, he has a great memory. But that's his attitude towards writing. And he has bring to another point is, it's interesting that whenever there's a new technology come along, and that's come writing, and there's always resistance, as it's going to be doomed or kind of diminish your current skills. And I remember very well when calculators just come out, and people, you saw these days, kids don't know how to multiplication and division anymore because you use a calculator. And now what? It helps us reduce to learn some of the skills which was essential but not necessary anymore when you have a calculator. And the list is going on and on. And I think new technology does help us in doing something, but the nature of it is it will reduce our natural ability, and it goes back to even to the early days. We rely on hunting and do everything, but once we develop agriculture, we don't know how to hunt. So this progress of technology, new technology, always take away some we call it innate ability, and which in a way it is bad individually at the time, but overall from evolution point of view, it's very, very important and great in advance our mind ability, and then comes to the brain, because the brain has a limited ability. If you have to do everything by the brain, then you don't have ability, room left for other things. So in a way that come back to the wisdom and the knowledge. We leave the brain to do the more and more important things, and then leave the trivial things to be done by technologists. And the computer is another example. Anyway, that's my comment.
Thank you. And the point that you made about technology being developed now to remind rather than to help us to remember, I think is an important point that we should consider. We've just got, unfortunately, about 5 minutes left. Maybe we can go, if it's okay with you, Eva, maybe we can go another 5 minutes after. So we'll take about 10 minutes to wrap up here, but we'll go to Moshe. Moshe, welcome.
This is a very strange passage, I think. It perplexes me because, earlier in the Phaedrus, we were talking about, how the soul goes into the human body by a process of getting close to the form. And, the souls below the surface, plunging, treading on one another, each striving to be first. And in there, the confusion and perspiration and extremity of effort, they're clawing at each other to get closer to the forms. And it says later, why is it important to get closer to the forms? Because it says it's the proximity to the form in which God abides, and in beholding which he is what he is. So God himself is only God because of his proximity to the forms, which have to be metaphorically higher, or more important. And I want to juxtapose that. Well, there are a couple of other things that I want to juxtapose this with. One is in the what you were describing before, the passage at 263a. But when one speaks of justice and goodness, we part company and are at odds with one another and with ourselves. I'm using the Joette translation. Just before that, Socrates makes the distinction of saying, well, when we speak of iron or silver, we know exactly what we're talking about. And I think that if you take a look at the passage of when we speak of justice and goodness, and instead of talking about justice and goodness, we talk about triangles and circles, we certainly have a clear idea of what triangles and circles are. So there are these concepts that we, in mathematics particularly, that we can be very, that we can be very, have a great deal of knowledge about. I would tie that around with some of the things that Wittgenstein says in the Tractatus about what meaningful language is, but that's another discussion. The thing that's peculiar, if I can wrap this all together, maybe I can't do it, about this idea of reminding and remembering is that the soul knows, the soul that gets into the human being as opposed to a giraffe is one that has gotten close to the forms and already has the knowledge. But it must be reminded of the knowledge, okay? It must recollect the knowledge, okay? And we recollect by being reminded. That's the whole thing about Socrates and the Timaeus, asking those questions that remind him of the things he already knows. So for Plato to put this in here, as I don't know, is he being tongue-in-cheek in criticizing himself and saying, well, this remembered stuff is important. It's more important than being reminded. But wait, we have to be reminded in order to be able to recollect the things that we had already learned when we had scratched our way closer to the forms. So if you'd comment on that, I'd be tickled.
Thank you. And I think it's a good point to kind of wrap up on, because, and unfortunately we won't get, I'd ask Eva, actually, if you just put Eva on the screen, that reading again on the third page, because it relates to something that we won't have time to get to today. And my big aha moment in Phaedrus was at 277C. And we won't get a chance to look at that today, but 277C is on the last page of the reading. But we'll just look at this reading on Thamus and Theuth. And I would just point out what I think is particularly important in here, which also relates to what I just said about 277C. But in this reading of Thamus and Theuth, right near the end, or mostly down in that paragraph, the last paragraph, it says, in fact, writing will introduce forgetfulness into the soul of those who learn it. They will not practice using their memory because they will put their trust in writing, which is external. And then I think the key words here, at least for me, and it says writing is external and depends on signs that belong to others. And to me, as I read this, I'm thinking, okay, so maybe we need to each develop our own signs, our own symbology, the things that have meaning to us based on our life experiences. And to me, this was the most powerful part of this particular section in here, was this idea that we have to develop our own internal symbology to relate these things to. So if the words justice and good, or just and good, are mentioned to me, well, I will relate that to things that happen in my life. I will relate that to things that I have found unjust, and things that I have found not to be good. And so I'll look for my own contrasts and develop my own internal meaning. But I think that's maybe this part of being able to not rely on external symbology, but to develop our own internal symbology as well, that, as Greg said, to keep that mental process going so that we don't default to somebody else's meaning. Because once we default to somebody else's meaning, we lose that maybe kind of ability to have some sort of agency in our own lives. And so I think that's maybe an important point to consider. And I thank you for raising it. I think it's a very key point. And maybe I'll just end by the key words in 277C, which I think relate to this. So this is on the last page, Eva. The next section, it's actually the last paragraph on this last page here. And to me, the key thing in here is what Socrates says. First, you must know, he says in terms of writing, first you must know the truth concerning everything you are speaking or writing about. You must learn how to define each thing in itself. Thing maybe meaning concept in itself. And having defined it, you must know how to divide it into kinds until you reach something indivisible. And I read that, and that to me was the big aha moment. It's taking the particulars that we deal with in our daily lives on which we base our meanings, and it's taking it back to the general, taking some sort of reasoned account, taking that which has become back to that which is, that indivisible is, that eternal, infinite is, something that is indivisible. And if, thinking about mathematics, thinking maybe something that's prime is divisible only by itself and one. And, maybe some, finding the prime basis of something is kind of the key here. And so maybe that's the real power of this idea of developing your own symbology, is so that you can then take the general form and make it into some kind of reasoned account. And so I just thank you for that question, Moshe. And I think, we can obviously go on for a long time about this. And I really want to, I think we will come back to Phaedrus at some point. I really, as I said, every time I read it, I find new meaning in it. So we're unfortunately at the point where we need to wrap up today's session. But I just, before I do, there's just a couple of things that I wanted to say. I didn't say at the beginning, but I think next time, we'll go and look at Critias, which is a very short dialogue. I was going to do this actually some weeks back, and I decided to get into Phaedrus first. But I'd like to go to Critias, which is really the remainder of Plato's Legend of Atlantis. It's a very short dialogue. It's only about a dozen pages, so it's an easy read. But it does pick up on the themes of language that we're discussing today. And I think it will be, and I'll put in the meetup notice that we can kind of remind ourselves about the first part of Timaeus, which also talks about Atlantis. And so we'll look at Critias. We'll focus on Critias next time, but we'll bring Timaeus into it as well, because certainly the first few pages of Timaeus talk about Atlantis. So maybe a little bit of a fun diversion, maybe from some of the depths of meaning that we get ourselves into here in the Phaedrus. But I think there's a purpose maybe that Plato has with this legend of Atlantis that has gripped the human imagination ever since he wrote it. So we'll look at Critias, and then I just, again, I wanted to, before passing it back to Eva to wrap us up for today, I wanted to just thank everybody so much for attending, and just great ideas. We will get this posted on the podcast site on rss.com. It's also available on Spotify now. So, just so many great ideas that people have brought forth that I didn't think about before. And, so I've learned in the process, and I hope everybody else has. And, again, thank you to our new participants today. And certainly a lot of knowledge has been added by your participation. So greatly appreciate that. And I will pass it over to Eva to wind us up.
Thank you. Who believes that we shouldn't leave? This will be this is a tough episode to finish up, and I can't stop mentioning that when I heard Socrates saying, like, now you have to know how to divide things, his image of his fingers and trying to put into categories, that was speaking to me on the schools of Athens, his presence there. So this was a big connection for me too. Well, we'll have to finish this anyway, so I'll have to do this. Thank you for joining today's live discussion and listening, friends. This was Plato's Pod, which was sponsored by 3 meetup groups: Toronto Philosophy Meetup, Calgary Philosophy Meetup, and Online Rebels. Always exciting to hear various perspectives, which we believe Plato, Aflatun crowd. Thank you, James Myers, for preparing. We know you're always ready to hear and learn with us. I'm Eve Alice. It was my privilege to coordinate today's meeting. See you at another episode, friends. Thank you.